Welcome back to my thumbnails series. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. Now this is going to be an interesting video because I make a lot of mistakes, and I wanted to use this video as an opportunity to show you how I handle mistakes. And as an added bonus, I actually have a new technique I'll show you as well. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about what you're seeing me do right now. I'm starting my sketch by laying down a couple of reference dots and reference lines. Now, it's important that I get these right because this will shape the overall perspective of my scene. And as you can see, as I start to connect the dots, it's hard to tell at this point, but I accidentally connected the wrong dots, and that was my first mistake. Now, coming up is where I make my second mistake. You can see me drawing a faint line that represents the middle column from my reference photo, and this line is correct, but it's actually the next line that I make that will get me into trouble later. It was at this time that I slipped into a bad habit, and that is to draw things from memory and not double check my reference photo. And what you're seeing me do is draw the middle column out of position. Now we'll see why this becomes an issue later and how I tried to address it, but right now I'm going to wrap up the right and left columns, then I'll start to draw the areas in between the columns. And here you'll notice that I've paused for a bit, and this is where I figured out my mistake. I just spotted the space in between the two columns, and I noticed that it was much skinnier than it was supposed to be. And as you can see from my reference photo, the spaces in between the columns should be identical, and in my sketch they're not. Now the great thing about sketching is that you don't have to be precise. That's why we practice, that's why I practice. But the more you practice these types of sketches, the more comfortable you'll get at transferring what you see in your reference photo correctly into your sketch. Despite the significant mistakes I've already made, you'll see in a bit how I make a couple of decisions to help minimize those mistakes. After spending some time cleaning up the columns and thickening up my line work, I'll do some hatching techniques across the ledge just to give it some separation. And then I'll start to adjust the top area of my sketch before I start to address my mistakes. Now, I wanted to talk about texture really quick. This building has a lot of brick texture, and one of the reasons I selected this sketch was because I wanted to practice capturing that texture. Lately, I've been experimenting with different types of texture in my urban sketches, and I thought this was a good opportunity to try brickwork. Okay, back to my mistakes. As you can see, I'm starting to block in the windows on the left side, and you'll notice that I'm blocking in the two windows, the same two windows that are represented in my reference photo. However, when I go over to the middle window, you'll notice that I'm only blocking in one window. This was an intentional decision to help minimize that mistake, and I guarantee if you went to the end of this video and see the final sketch, you probably wouldn't have noticed any mistakes unless I mention it. One of the things that I mentioned before about urban sketching is choosing the right composition. I really like it when different features kind of extend off the surfaces of the buildings, and this helps provide additional depth in my scene, kind of like those metal balconies. So I'm always looking for those types of features. Now I'm going to wrap up the final detail here before I move over and start texturing my scene. And this next part is a little tedious, and I'll speed through the sections, but I'm going to explain exactly what's going on. Basically, I'm adding hatch lines to my scene that follow the brickwork, and I am deliberately slowing down where I need to in order to make sure that those hatch lines are relatively spaced out evenly, and I'll do this for the entire building. Now this is a good time for me to stop and mention that if you are enjoying my content, please give it a like and subscribe. Now, once I wrap up those lines, I'm going to switch over to a new technique to hold my pen. I'm not sure if it was the coffee I was drinking earlier, but when I started to go back over and draw the lines that represents the individual bricks, I couldn't get my pen steady enough. So what I'm doing is I'm just using one finger from my other hand to apply pressure to the tip of my pen, and this gives me much greater control over my pen, which allows me to add that fine brick detail. Now I'll go ahead and finish that up for the rest of the building, and then I'll move over to shading. Now I'm going to be using my Copic number 2 neutral gray to add all my midtones, and as I start to shade my entire scene, you'll notice that it starts to look very flat. And it really isn't until I move over to the shadows that we add that contrast that makes everything pop. Now, if I am working on a scene and my reference photo doesn't have a lot of contrast, I will typically exaggerate the contrast just so I can produce a nice dynamic final sketch. Once my darker shading is complete, I'm going to go ahead and finish up by using my Copic number 2 again and start to shade random bricks. If you're familiar with alcohol markers, you might remember that you can layer in the color and get a slightly darker shade. I'll continue to darken random bricks until my scene is complete, and there's my final sketch. As you can see, my final sketch looks pretty good, and you probably wouldn't have been able to spot my mistakes unless you knew about them. And that's the great thing about sketching. If you just power through it, oftentimes you'll find out that your sketch will come up just fine.